Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the makeup of the United Kingdom. First of all, we have two different types of government systems in democracies. We have the presidential system where voters elect the legislative and executive separately, and then the executive nominates and the legislative approves your judicial branch. But our look here at the United Kingdom is a different type of government system, a different type of democratic government system, and that's a parliamentary system where the voters vote for the members of the parliament, which is equal to a Congress, except it's called a parliament, but it's the lawmaking branch. Now, in a parliamentary system, the majority party, whoever wins, gets to choose. They vote in. The parliament actually votes in the prime minister, which is the executive, and appoints the judicial branch that's going to be your Supreme Court. So notice the power in this system is actually with parliament, less so the prime minister and the judicial branch. The UK has no formal written constitution, and it is technically called a constitutional monarchy. It is a full fledged democracy, even though it has actual royalty and a part of government, the House of Lords, that is hereditary, handed over time. But when it comes down to it, three branches do exist, but only one really matters. All right. And that's the one that is residing at Westminster Palace. This is where the legislative branch resides, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But even there, only one branch of, or one half of one branch of government really matters, and that is the House of Commons. This is the elected part of the legislative branch, elected by the people of the United Kingdom. And this is the hall of the House of Commons. People that serve here are known as members of parliament. The same thing as like a congressman, and they serve, like in the United States, a district. And this district represents about 65,000 people. They serve 5-year terms in a fixed election cycle. But here in the United Kingdom, the prime minister can actually dissolve parliament and call for elections, which means literally here within the span of a few weeks, um, you would hold elections for the House of Commons again. And if a prime minister thinks they can get more seats for their party in that election, they'll often dissolve parliament and take a shot at it. Now, between 2011 and 2022, there was something called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which said basically that the only votes you can hold were needed two-thirds of the House of Commons must agree to hold a snap election, or the Parliament can vote out the prime minister in something called the vote of no confidence. The vote of no confidence still exists, but at this point, as of 2022, a prime minister can just simply call for elections at any time. Now, the party in power's prime minister plus the cabinet is known as the government. So when you hear about the government, it's going to be the winning majority party's prime minister and the cabinet officials. And they make 99% of the policy that happens within the government. It's not like a whole party issue. You just follow what the cabinet and your prime minister does. The opposition is known as the shadow government, the loyal opposition. At this time, Labor actually runs the government, and the Conservatives are the loyal opposition, headed by Kemi Badenoch. Now, it's not like the United States where the opposition actually has a chance to do anything. In the UK, the opposition creates what's called a shadow government. So they have like matching positions, they have matching roles, but in the end, there's no ability for the opposition to stop anything. They can't stop any legislation. So if you're the majority party in the House of Commons, you're getting whatever legislation you want. The opposition just kind of talks smack and brings that out to the people. The Speaker is the person that kind of referees the House of Commons. He's not really attached to any party. He doesn't have any power. So he just kind of referees. Everybody behave yourself and follow the traditions of the House of Commons. Be good. The second, the upper house has not really that much power. It is known as the House of Lords. It is the appointed part. There is no elections here. You have your church officials, the life peers, which are those are the ones that are granted by the crown. The king decides with a recommendation of the prime minister who's going to be there. And then you have the old school hereditary peers, where nobility actually has their seat handed down over time. This is actually no longer allowed. They only have one power in the House of Lords, and that is to delay legislation. They talk, they research, but they only have that what's called suspensive veto. Oh, we're going to hold off on this as long as we can. But ultimately, if the House of Commons says, nope, that's happening, it's going to eventually happen. The House of Lords can't do a whole lot about it. Yes, it's a very plush, decorative location. And yes, some of them actually do still wear wigs. This is an example of like some of the delay that they were able to do. Back in the 2000 aughts, there was an attempt to ban fox hunting from the House of Commons. The House of Lords were like, this is an old traditional thing. They got the delay kicked for a while, but eventually it was pared down, and in general, it's been banned. The old judicial branch used to reside in the House of Lords as well. And so they were able to delay the creation of the UK Supreme Court, but eventually in 2009, that even happened again. All that the House of Lords can do is suspensive veto. So here's the makeup of the government. You got the monarch, which has no political position at all. The voters elect the parliament, which chooses the executive branch, whoever wins the majority party, and the judicial branch. And then, of course, you have the House of Commons, House of Lords, the House of Commons elected, House of Lords not. Okay. But ultimately, that's what really matters, the legislative branch. If you can't win a majority in the House of Commons, you need to get some other party to jump in, do some deal making, and create a coalition. In 2010 was the last time this happened, when conservatives and labor did not get a majority. So liberal Democrats here said, who's going to give me the better deal? And eventually the conservatives did, and the conservatives took over the House of Commons and got their prime minister, David Cameron, in power. Now, speaking of the prime minister, the executive branch has two roles. One is to be head of state, which is your international symbol for being the leader of your country. Another is the head of government. They run the bureaucracy, they create agenda of what the government's going to do, they enact laws, and they propose laws that they hope get passed. We have the head of state of the UK as Prince Charles. The problem is he's not really much. I mean, they see him as the king, and he's got the hand grenade thing over here, but he has no political power at all. So he is officially the head of state, but the head of government is actually the one that matters, and that is the prime minister. So let's go over some prime ministers. I'm going to put an asterisk over the ones that you should know, but just in case you hear the names of other ones, they'll be familiar. Margaret Thatcher comes to power in 1980. She's very controversial, and she basically, the UK between 1945 and 1979, very left of center in terms of their economic policies, a lot of nationalization of government industry. Margaret Thatcher comes in and brings in privatization, brings in much more globalization. So she really shifted to a more privatized economy in 1980. And eventually, income inequality really kicks in, and she gets voted out of office. John Major's kind of like, was a conservative next, but didn't do much. Tony Blair is going to be referenced, probably very popular. He creates something called the third way, basically creating more liberal, left of center social values, but more conservative economic values. Extremely popular, but he sided with George W. Bush during the Iraq War and was also removed from power. Gordon Brown, he was there during the Great Recession, didn't do much. David Cameron comes to power in 2010. Extremely popular, young, brash, kind of this aristocratic, but eventually he proposed this thing called Brexit, not thinking it would actually get a vote. And he said, no, I'm going to leave if Brexit actually happens. And it happened. So he got kicked out of power. Theresa May came next and basically trying to maneuver through Brexit, couldn't do it. She was removed from power. And her whole thing was, how do we make Brexit work? Boris Johnson, he was almost entirely based on how do you get Brexit to actually do anything? Like, how do we do a Brexit? Eventually, he went through COVID and resigned during a scandal. He also had the most crazy hair of any AP6 country. Liz Truss jumped in. She lasted like a few weeks. And the old joke was, can Liz Truss outlast this head of lettuce? And eventually Liz Truss lost. Rishi Sunak was very unpopular, and he, for some reason, thought that if he held a snap election, he'd win. He didn't. He lost. So now we have the current prime minister. That is Keir Starmer, and he is the current prime minister of the United Kingdom, part of the Labour Party. The Prime Minister's cabinet is about 24 cabinet ministers. They actually control the bureaucracy. They help in policy making. They make sure that whatever happens, you always follow the dogma and doctrine of the party. But understand, the prime minister's cabinet are members of the House of Commons, and eventually they want to become prime minister. So they kind of check the power of other cabinet members and the prime minister. So when you watch the cabinet in the House of Commons, the people on either side of the prime minister, other parts of the government, they eventually want to become prime minister. And there's a little political maneuvering and wrangling that actually happens, unlike the cabinet in the United States, where really they aren't other members of government. They actually have to quit their other jobs to become members of the president's cabinet in the US. Cabinet members will never speak out publicly against the prime minister, ever, 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 ever. This is known as collective responsibility. They always want to, because if you start, crumbling, and this is like Boris Johnson started to have leaks in his cabinet, and then when he started to get people in public speaking out against him, the realization was he was toast. But your party wants to control the House of Commons, and to do that, everybody must be on the same page always. So cabinet members will never speak out against the prime minister ever. The last one is the courts. The UK Supreme Court came out in 2009. They do civil cases and constitutional cases that affect their population. Do they have actual judicial review? Technically, yes, but there's no like constitution. So all that the UK Supreme Court can do is actually make sure that Parliament follows its own laws, since there's no, so if Parliament, the House of Commons, is like, hey, we want to do this, that's all the Supreme Court can do is say, hey, that's not what your own law says you can do. All right, so that's the judicial branch of the UK Supreme Court.